Okay. So, again, my name is Steve Burns, and I work as Android architect here at Ancestry. And usually I give this, we've given this presentation, this will be about the third time now with just a larger group, medium-sized group. And I usually do this with Bart Whiteley, who is the iOS architect. He'll usually do half the slides, I'll do the other half. So we'll see what we get tonight with me doing all the slides by myself. But again, thanks for coming. I hope you feel welcome here. If you need to get more pizza, feel free to go grab some. Let's see, so just kind of an intro to this and sort of what was some of the motivation behind this. We spent, well, over the last couple of years, kind of looking at architecture. And as I present some of the slides, you kind of get a feel for why we even started to do that. And some of the kind of reasons why we went the direction we went. It's been interesting over the last couple of years. We've had a lot of interesting debate, and John is kind of smiling over here a little bit, but yeah, there's a lot of people that have had input to this architecture, and it's not something that I just came up with, or Bart and I, or Carl mandated, but there's been a lot of people who have had input on it. I think that's why it's continuing to take shape the way it is, and we expect that it will be kind of this growing thing that will, as we encounter some areas that feel a little bit clunky, we'll get those to work a little bit better. I mentioned that we first did this presentation at our tech conference in July this year. And we gave it again for what we call an Ancestry Tree Talk. That was probably early last month. And so this is really the third time to do this. Again, with Bart not being here, we'll see what kind of version we end up doing on the slides. So we came up with this MVP Plus, which it turns out this can mean a lot of things to a lot of different people, particularly the presenter part of it. And so I was actually going to put onto this slide, I actually had it in here, a name change, and I took it out. But we'll see what happens. Carl kind of threw out UMA or something like that, Unified Mobile Architecture. But anyway, I was going to have that slide in, but we left that out. So let's see here. So mobile and Ancestry. In the past, we had two apps. Our main core app, where you can download your tree, you can manage that, you can add people to it, put photos in there, and also find it. I think, if I remember this right, we had an iOS version of that, and then Wes worked on the Android one. Pretty much did it single-handedly. But life was a lot simpler back then. Just had a couple of apps, and everything was mostly great.
Not too many developers either.
Yeah, exactly. That's right.
Not as many hands.
When I came onto the team, I was like one of 4 guys, so it's actually grown a lot, and we think we have a really great team here. Now we have 4. We actually added We're Related over the last couple of years. We added We're Related and DNA apps for both Android and iOS platforms. What does the future look like? Not really sure. Executives and product team, they're constantly looking at, hey, what markets do we need to be in? What does that mean for mobile and the web? And there's a lot of decisions to be made there. But we think there'll be other stuff that's coming. And we have 2 platforms in the past, or in the present now. But in the future, what other modes will we have? What other platforms will we have? Well, we're not really sure. And so preparing for that, planning for that, can be a little bit difficult. So it presented us with some challenges, having different languages, different technology stacks, and just really, you want to give your customers, you want to give users what, the native feel and the look and all of that. And so you want to take advantage of that, but you want to be able to do things in a way where you can share as much as you can. That makes sense, but that ends up, that can end up being a challenge. And then, of course, right now we have teams we have some in San Francisco, our office there, we have a big group of mobile developers here, we have some contractors in the Ukraine. So now you're working across time zones as well. So all those things, we looked at that and decided we actually need to take a step back, take a look at what architecture we have, or maybe what architecture we don't have, and make some changes. So one of the things we looked at was solid, and I don't know if all of you are familiar with that mnemonic, but I don't know that Robert Martin is the guy who came up with all that, but he's talked for a long time about clean architecture. And really these solid principles were ones that were kind of a subset distilled out of what he gets out. He promotes, he writes books. I think Carl's got the latest book that he's put out, but really good stuff to get developers thinking about, okay, if you want to have great architecture, these are the things you need in there. So we looked at solid, and we wanted to make sure that we were following that, because that seemed like the right thing to do, and that's what all the experts say to do. The other thing we wanted to have is reusable modules, because as you're building these apps, why do we want to have the same code having to be reproduced in all the different apps? And it just made sense to do that. And inevitably, when you're creating those bits of code, you want a way to test those. And that, I'm not saying that's the end all thing, is that you should be able to create, unit tests or integration tests. But it does become very important when you have modules that you want to deliver into apps, and you want them to be able to consume those in a way that they can be very, very confident that they're getting a really good piece of software that they're bringing in. It's like when you go out and look for some third-party thing that you want to bring into your application. You want to look for what's got great reviews, lots of people talking about it. Those are quality pieces of software. And then we also wanted to have a common language, or we could talk cross-platform. And it's actually a little bit funny here, is because they say that among developers, a lot of times it's like code styling and white space and all that ends up being maybe the things that you debate the most and contend on the most. And we've definitely had lots of warm discussions about how we name things. Which in some ways it feels like, wow, we're talking about this too much. But naming is important, because we need to have a common language. We need to make sure that we're speaking the same dialect when we talk about things, particularly across platform. And just one little note on that is, organizationally, we are structured completely different than what we used to be. We actually have teams that have both iOS and Android on them, and we're working on the same features kind of in lockstep. So in the spirit of Ancestry, we do a lot of family history work here, and with tree data, and she's smiling over here, but we kind of want to show, if you were to represent the architecture that we have today, you might do it this way. I'm not saying it's completely accurate, but the point of this is that the foundational things that this is built on, they've been around for decades now. There's really nothing new that we've come up with here. And so we could just close on this slide and be done with it. But it's important to kind of see, hey, there is kind of a progression here. And if you were to put things together, this might be how you would do it. I don't know if that's more of an entertainment slide or not. If Bart were here, he'd probably have a lot better things to say on that slide, but there you go. Okay, so to introduce us, M for model, B for view, and P for presenter. And if you've touched any sort of architecture at all, you've probably seen that before. But to kind of expand on that down to the stack that I'm going to cover today, when you think about model, think about interactors and adapters, and think of that kind of holistically. Where's my data? How something's going to get it for me. I don't necessarily care how, but this model concern is going to be the one that handles all of that. The view would be the part that, the user's going to see this piece, and we're going to have some logic there that sets values and fields and reacts to user input. We couple that with this thing we call a navigation coordinator, and I'll discuss that a little bit more on why we want that additional separation. And but that is to help us transition from one view to another. And then how we want to treat presenters and show how they are directly tied to a given view, and that really what their job is to service that view. Okay, so to kind of introduce this and kind of watch how data flows through the stack, we thought we'd take this. I know this should be an Android device here, but we'll work through this together, so we gotta go with it. But we have a reference app that we created that does this place lookup feature. And so to see how that flows from when the user types that text in and how it does the place matching and all the different layers it goes through, I thought I'd walk you through how that happens. So in the view, the user types in Lehigh or something like that, and it immediately just gets passed off to the presenter. So just a simple text string. Presenter takes that and sends it down to the interactor. So interactor is supposed to know what to do, how to get things. Interactor checks this, and this may be one way that you decide to implement this, but it's, in this case, we want to be thinking about how can we be responsible with battery, with network, with our Ancestry backend service that we're going to end up calling here if we don't find it in the cache. So implement a cache, maybe it has a time to live on there of, I don't know, a couple hours or something. It all depends on what your business requirements are. And for this demonstration, let's suppose that data wasn't found in there. We found no matches there. Interactor goes, okay, I know what to do. I'm going to talk to the Ancestry service adapter, which in turn makes a network request to our place authority on the back end. That returns some JSON. And one thing I want to point out right here is that you're going to see how data kind of moves through these layers. From the user, we got a simple string that kind of works its way through. Here we have JSON coming back, and then you'll see how it gets transformed as we go through the layers. So here, the Ancestry service adapter says, oh, okay, I'm going to deserialize this thing, and I'm going to put it into this list of place items. A place item could be a whole bunch of stuff. Lat long, could be componentized place fields. It could be a whole bunch of stuff. It might even be historical. This place was named something else many years ago. Could contain all that. We have a very rich set of that on our back end. So it passes that back up to the interactor. The interactor says, okay, I know I need to drop it to the cache in case they look for Lehigh again. And then I will tell the presenter. And you'll see a little subtlety here as the presenter goes, well, yeah, I got place objects in my list, but really what the view wants is just simple strings. So I'm going to transform that to simple strings, and I'm going to pass that up to the view. And then you see the list, which did match what I had in my other demonstration, but there's a list right there. So that's kind of like a sort of a quick walkthrough of how the data flows through the system. So as I was mentioning before, when you think of the model area, think of this interactor piece and it kind of encapsulating all of what goes on down below the presenter. And again, now we have the ability to implement new screens with their company, with their associated presenters, and just tie into existing interactors to just get the data that I need, whether it's I need to download some tree data or do a search, like lookup or any of those things. This piece right here is ready to be used. The other thing that hopefully you caught in there is that with each one of these layers, as you go down through it, we want to be looking for providing the best API for the consuming layer above. That ends up being really important for just consuming it, providing the right API surface, and being able to test as well. So again, when we think about models, there can be entities that you end up using across all those layers. You might also create entities that are specific to a feature or set of related features. And then this is some of the stuff that I already went over about providing APIs that are really good for the layers up above. But really, what it lets you do is you really begin to separate out the different concerns. And you're able to reason better about what goes where when you have some new piece of logic that needs to be implemented. And also those cross-cutting concerns we're finding out become very important. As an interactor and its functionality grow, you want to do that in a way that is sensible for a new feature so that it doesn't have to come along and say, well, what are the methods that I need to use in here for what I need to get done without having to look through a really big API surface. Okay, and then one of the approaches we took with data was just to be. Let me step back for just a minute here. If you were to go look at our legacy code that we use, the classes that we use for data in our Ancestry Trees app, you can see that it's actually got a lot of concerns rolled into one. It's deserializing network JSON. It's writing things to the database. It's also acting as our models that we use in a lot of areas in our code. And so one of the things that we want to do is make working with these models very simple. And so on Swift, they use structs to do that. And on Android, we use either POCOs or POJOs, depending on if you use Kotlin or Java. The other thing that can end up being a problem is the way that data flows through the different layers. If it flows unidirectionally, then you really can avoid a lot of these problems where what is the app state? Is the app state, does that piece of the code over there have the real app state, or is it over here, or is it in some database somewhere? It becomes a lot more predictable figuring that out. As well, we wanted to have immutable data, which there's definitely pros and cons from when you have immutable data versus mutable data, but it does help avoid a lot of problems around concurrency and bugs that come up from that. And also, we wanted to be able to make sure that we're handling transformations between the layers in a sensible way. So at any one of those layers in the code, there may be some helper code that is there specifically for transforming data into the consumable form specific for that feature. So as we look at this MVP stack, let's talk a little bit more about the view. This could mean a few different things to everybody. So just to be clear, when we talk about view on our team, what we are referencing here, we're referencing, maybe you have a view that's composed of other views. So that might be one representation. It's going to be, we look at it as the layout plus the controller side, which on Android is the activity code without all the other view stuff. There are plenty of activities that have a lot of other concerns roll in. But then also how do the views communicate with one another? it could be done through a delegate pattern or closures. And we'll also talk about how that can be done with the presenter layers, interactor layers as well. Part of that comes about because it turns out you can be very complex in the way that you implement all of this stuff. You can implement lots of interfaces and lots of classes, and the question you want to keep asking yourself is, how do I get this, I think John Bob mentioned this to me the other day, this minimum viable architecture. What is the architecture that I need for this app that I'm implementing that gives me that MVA architecture that I'm looking for? Where I have an architecture there because, you know, this needs to be an app that needs to be testable, and it needs to be something that is a great experience for your customers. You can release it with confidence. And so that ends up being really important, is keeping it as simple as it can be for the features that you're implementing. So presenter, as I mentioned before, it will use one or more interactors, and its job really is to serve the view that it's associated with. It could serve multiple views if you're doing, you know, maybe some A/B testing. You might have the same presenter. If you can get away with it, do that. But really, we see it as being one presenter servicing one view. And it's going to handle any data transformations, threading concerns if they need to be handled there, although there's some debate around that as well that we've had. And ideally, this is one of the layers in our system that we want to be able to unit test. And so we're trying really hard to keep SDK imports out of our presenters and just have them deal with these specific concerns. And that way we can test them in isolation. So the interactor is going to have a fair amount of, that's where you expect to find that business logic about where do I get data, how do I mutate data, and it's going to use any number of adapters underneath, but the common ones are going to be, you know, network, persistence. What else do we have in there? Transforming, right? You may have some translators in there. And usually this stuff is going to be done asynchronously. And then adapters, when you think adapters, think you know, any kind of, maybe it's third-party stuff that you're bringing in. You might be using SQLite. All those details we really want to kind of shove outside of what the feature world is. We were kind of diagramming this the other day on the whiteboard, and the worldview of a lot of our legacy code has been very wide. And what we want to do is we want to shrink that down into just what its responsibility is. And having all of this stuff be referenced directly from our views was, frankly, it was killing us. So being able to move that to these outer edges below interactors turns out to be a really, really great practice. Turns out it's not easy to do that. And I'll actually talk about that a little bit more later, because we're coming up with some ways to refactor code. Oh yeah, and yeah, so abstracting all the details away about how to use a third-party library or some other module that you get for it. So the other thing that we wanted to handle as a separate concern, a very distinct concern, particularly in a larger app, is the navigation concerns. So this can end up getting really pretty messy, as I'm going to show you here in just a minute. Bart does a lot better job of this than I do, but for our war-related app, I don't know if you can see these lines on here. See these red ones here? But this right here is the onboarding screens for our war-related app. And it fits really, really well with this presentation because to try to figure out how to navigate all that from one screen to another, it can get really, really messy. Particularly if you have product coming back to you and saying, oh, you know what, we need to have this here. Oh, it needs to come in from multiple places now. And what's the state of your app when it comes, if it gets back routed and comes back, where do you pick up at? All those things end up getting really, really messy very quickly. So we decided what we need here is this thing called a sign-up coordinator that can eliminate all this direct interaction between screens. And it's the thing that handles all the transitions from one screen to another. So we call them navigation coordinators, or just coordinators for short. I know that's an overloaded term, but when we're talking about our MVP plus architecture, that's a terminology we use, but it's going to encapsulate those navigation concerns. Now, so imagine this. The way it works is you're sitting on a screen and the user hits some button. Maybe it's the save button. They hit the save button. What's supposed to happen then? Well, tell the presenter, save some data. It handles all of that concern. Now what are we supposed to do? Well, we're probably going to, if we're listening reactively, we'll listen for a success on the save, and then we'll tell this navigator, hey, by the way, we just had a save. Do you want to do something? And the navigation coordinator will just handle whatever's supposed to happen next. That way our screens are completely independent of one another, and we don't have this, I think one of our developers says the shotgun approach to refactoring, where you have to go to all these different places and modify your code just to implement a new feature. And what we want here is we don't want the leaf views to know about one another. So if you're looking at our MVP stack, we can put that under management of coordinator. And then as we need to transition to another screen, we actually have the coordinator do that. And then another transition. And then I did that twice. And one of the things that we've been experimenting with a little bit lately is having coordinators being managed by other coordinators, which I think it works pretty well. Looks like it does. And so imagine you have like an app coordinator with feature coordinators underneath it. Art found this somewhere. It's really cool, but it'll make you dizzy after a while. It actually says it in the slides. Don't make people dizzy. Okay. So at the top level, you might have an app coordinator, and then underneath that, separate feature coordinators, and then you can have view coordinators under there. Again, this is an area where we have begun to experiment with, and we think it works really well. I think we ran into a couple of gotchas here and there, but.
Do you have questions right now or at the end?
What's that?
Questions right now or at the end?
About this?
Yeah.
Yeah, sure.
Who's aware of the coordinator, the view?
The view, yeah.
Okay.
That's actually a great question, and I thought of that as I was going through the slides. I thought that's like one of the lines that we're missing there, but I think maybe it was supposed to be inferred from the coordinator there, and then you see the view. Yeah, but the view is. That's been debated as well.
Yes, it can.
So yeah, and again, I'll just make a comment on that kind of generally, not really specifically, but it turns out to be easier to test things if we can have the layers, if we can really restrict what other layers a layer is allowed to talk to, right? That way you don't have, one layer that's just, it ends up being that C part of MVC that's knowing everything that's going on. Okay, so let's see. Oh yeah. And then one of the things that we wanted to do, like I mentioned before, was have modules that are reusable. We've been doing some experimenting with frameworks and libraries. I know Matt's done some of that with libraries on the Android side. Just trying to figure out, okay, what's like a good way to implement these, and how do we get them into our CI process? And as we're creating these modules, we're really trying to think about having clean interfaces that look really, really easy to consume. The dependencies, they're easy to deliver to those, and we really just keep the details kind of black box away.
Should I talk about the authentication module a little bit briefly, because that's an example of.
Oh, yeah. So it's actually, we'll go to this screen. So yeah, we're actually working on a couple right now. So this is supposed to, if you could see it on the left side, it's supposed to, it's like a list of the iOS frameworks they've been implementing recently, or have been over several months or years or so. Some of them are older than others, a lot older. And then on the Android side, I don't know if these are really complete lists, probably aren't. But some of the recent ones we've been doing where we have multiple apps and we know we need to have a login, for example, is we have an authentication module that we've been working on. And then
So that provides like a whole entire feature wrapped up UI.
Yeah. And so that's one of the other things we've been looking at is having the UI combined in our auth module, for example. Being able to do that, but allow the app to override look and feel of it. So we're kind of experimenting with some of that. We think we know how to do it well without adding tons of work. So what's the current state? We have some of these models we're working on that are, you're starting with a clean slate. You're able to implement this clean architecture right from the get-go. We also have like the DNA app, you know, from day one, it had an architecture in there that was pretty close to what I talked about tonight. But our Trees app has a lot of this legacy code in it. So where are we at on that? Well, not too far along, it seems. Like sometimes we look at it and go, wow, there's so much code there. What do you do? And so over the last just couple of weeks here, we've really been breaking it down into like consumable pieces. And I should probably mention that we actually had, I'm going to use the word failure here because I think it's actually appropriate. We actually had plenty of failures in trying to refactor big chunks of that code, and it just didn't work really well. Either you might go to the work of creating a big pull request, and then the reviewers are going, I have no idea if this is going to kill the entire app, so how can I improve it? Right? You end up with that. So we had to look at how do we break this thing down into pieces that we can get merged into the code base and then release them with confidence. And so we're still kind of working on that. Maybe we'll have a follow-up at some point where we talk about here were some of the things we were able to achieve and how we did it. We don't have a whole lot of data there yet, so.
I think it's good to point out that you learn along the way, and that's why it's good. Don't just stop and rewrite everything, because you don't know how to do it yet. Nobody does. And so you learn as you go along and what works, what doesn't work. And, you know, especially when you're communicating with.
You know what, that's actually a really good reminder, John, about probably one of the overriding things that we've discussed in all of our architecture discussions is just separating concerns. Yeah, we've had so much code that's just had every concern in it, and breaking that apart becomes really difficult. So that, you know, a lot of times ends up being step one. How do we actually start putting things in their proper place? And yeah, we're not allowed to just stop and rewrite everything. You got to release features. So yeah, we think we're getting more well-positioned for our future growth, whatever that means, this way or that way, or multiple three-dimensional now or something.
Like I think it would be hard to bring on all these new people if we hadn't already made some progress.
Yeah.
Everyone would be lost right now.
Oh yeah, for sure. So yeah, and it's facilitated a lot of design conversations as well, because that's one of the other things we've done is we have like a first iteration of what we call a dev design, where you sit down with, you know, your cross-platform counterparts and you talk through what is this feature going to do? What should we call the different components of it, classes, and try to break it down. There's still more work we need to do there in actually rolling it out across our mobile organization, but we're working on it. And then we'll end with this quote from Uncle Bob. And I guess what I would say around this, what we've run into is, as you're doing a feature, you might think, well, I need to have all these same pieces across every feature. And that turns out to not be the case. There's some sort of like artsy design part to it, component, I don't know what you call that, where you go, you know what, do we need this thing here? And if we do, should it be shaped a little bit different than where we have it in this other feature? There's going to be times where you actually may not need a presenter, or you may not need a coordinator. And so, you know, keep your mind open to being able to kind of shuffle that around a little bit and look for what seems like the right approach. Again, if you're thinking about separating concerns, then you'll be a lot better off. And that is the end of the slides. Questions?
When will you be done?
What's that?
When will you be done?
I'm done now.
No, I mean, with the transition.
Never. It's never done. 2020. That's not really what you meant. Are you talking about like the trees after the chimney?
Yeah, I'm implying that with larger code bases, it does take time and it's incremental, right? We have many different themes at different states. We did this with the iOS side of things, and the first year was like, this is terrible, this is not working, and we were figuring things out at the time and constantly changing things. But now that we have a process in place, like the second year just totally changed.
Yeah, because each feature, as you move along, should be able to benefit from the one that came before, right?
Right.
Yeah.
So I'm implying that it takes time, but your code is going to be there whether you do anything or not. And now on the iOS side, we can go in and say, I know how this works, or if I don't, it's not that hard to understand, as hard to understand, as well as you have many people touching areas of the code that people were afraid to touch before. Because of that, like they had to fix it and do whatever, there's more domain knowledge that's gained in this process. We're more confident about how our changes will affect it.
I thought maybe you were going to mention the C++ part there when you
I'm
said
not even
don't touch
touching
that
that.
code.
With the coordinator, are you basically just swapping views, or are you actually starting activities and having a backstack of your navigation?
Yeah, we'll just call for activity transition, you'll just say sorry.
Okay.
But it could do many of those things. I think we're probably gonna end up with switching between activities, switching between fragments, and switching between custom views. It's
I don't want to get away from
Yeah,
fragments. I don't know if you're going to talk about that in your presentation.
Are you also, does the coordinator also pass data that needs to be, passed between activities?
Yeah, so, you know, we all know you can put those in bundles and start that way. That isn't really like a favorite way of, I don't know. Why did Android come up with what they did? I don't know. But anyway, that's what we have to work with. We may talk about it in a future one of these. We've looked at some ways to inject that. Basically create your stuff, bring up the activity, and then say, hey, give me my dependencies now, right? And it just kind of does all that without doing bundles, but yeah, we kind of explored that a little bit as well. I don't know if that answers your question.
Yeah, well, so that's basically it, but that's still the job of the coordinator.
Yeah. Well,
Well, you need some kind of data to decide.
yeah. Maybe not necessarily, but yeah, getting the parameters there, yes, that's how we're doing it now.
But hopefully you can move as much of that down to the data layer as possible. So you're not passing around gigantic JSON strings to be parsed or whatever. Like store those to a database, store those to some persistent thing down in your data layer, and that should bubble up to the presenter to the view. So only pass like a person ID or pass your minimum stuff through the bundle.
Yeah, and then because we have had what I call bundle views. I don't know if you guys have run into that, right? hey, look at this, I have 3 things. Actually, it's, you get an exception.
Yeah, crushes.
Yeah, you get crashes now if you do that. So, yeah, that feels like a really terrible abuse of bundles, but yeah, like what John was saying, yeah, if you can kind of rehydrate it from some ID, that's perfect. And those are easily pass-through bundles or some other kind.
What about the new the new architecture components that handle like view models and live data?
Yeah, that's a
That's
great
an
question.
interesting.
Do your
Don't
presenters
yet.
survive configuration changes? Do they stick
Um,
around or they get recreated?
Yeah, they can. We've we could talk about that more.
To like the view models where it basically like retains those.
Yeah, basically like a little preview of this injector thing that we worked on is it can hold on to your presenter statically and then get you across a configuration change. Yeah, and I think there's other companies, I think you found one that was doing something very similar to that.
Yeah, there's a lot of vendors that do that. It's kind of, and then the view models. Very similar.
Other questions?
You never said when you're gonna be done.
I successfully avoided that.
No, we mean done now.
Yeah, I'm done. Oh, yeah, I'm done now. Okay. Thank you. Wait, what do I do? Stop video?
No.
Or, I'm gonna let